Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you all. For those of you who can turn your cameras on, it's great to see faces at this event. But if you can't, I completely understand. My name is Andrew Engel, and I'm Senior Programmer at Reimagine. Welcome, everybody. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white cisgender male with glasses, a colorful shirt that Rabbi Tirzah complimented me on earlier just now. It kind of looks like sea glass, and in the back, I've got a bright orange wall. Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. People of different backgrounds, ages, races, and faiths, and people of no faith, all coming together in the hopes of healing ourselves and the world. We specifically support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality, and at our own pace, we actively channel life's biggest challenges into meaningful action and growth. As some of you may know, this series on collective trauma and transformation kicked off 2 weeks ago with a conversation among mental health professionals and trauma survivors from underrepresented communities. They spoke of their experiences of loss and transformation, primarily from Latinx and LGBTQ+ perspectives, but the discussion also featured reflections from participants who identify as African American, Asian American, and other communities. Today is the first anniversary of the massacre in Uvalde, Texas. Let's take a moment to honor the memory of the 19 children and 2 teachers from Robb Elementary School.
With men, but make no mistake.
Thank you. When this series began, it was just a few weeks after yet another mass shooting in Texas. And in Chicago, over last weekend, there were 23 shootings, including the death of Ronnie Roper, just steps away from the community center of a gun violence prevention group where he worked. But despite all these horrors, we go forward. It's all we can do. And we're not necessarily healed, but perhaps with some tools to integrate these adversities and losses, we can step forward. Last week, Dr. Albert Wong, a somatic psychologist, explained how our bodies hold so much of this trauma, and he offered some strategies to integrate those horrors that some of us have experienced directly, and those of us who have experienced those horrors vicariously through social media and the internet. And in the panel discussion 2 weeks ago, guests shared how they used creative expression, acts of service, and spirituality to process their grief and loss. Psychologist Manuel Zamarripa suggested that collective trauma requires not only self-care, but also collective care. And Isaias Hernandez, a 20-something climate justice activist who often manages his own eco-anxiety and grief, urged us to connect with the hope keepers. Today, our focus is on taking action, and action can come in all forms, big steps and small steps. And I want to say that just by showing up today, all of you are doing this work. The majority of us are Zooming here from the United States, also known as Turtle Island by Native Americans and their allies. I'm in Lenapehoking, where a large city called New York is located on occupied land. Wherever you are, I ask you to join me in acknowledging Indigenous communities in North America, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. I'm stating this because it's a step, another action step, to continue dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. I'm very interested in knowing where all of you are And if you haven't done so already, please put that in the chat. And I'll be pasting later on a map. It's called native-land.ca. And you can check that out to learn about locations of Indigenous people. Okay. And now, finally, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speakers. Paul Carrillo is the Vice President of Giffords Center for Violence Intervention. He was raised in Southeast Los Angeles in an environment with gangs, drugs, and gun violence. In 2001, he began his career as a volunteer for a hospital-based violence intervention program. And in 2005, he co-founded Southern California Crossroads, a nonprofit organization that provides violence prevention and intervention services throughout the greater LA region. In 2012, Paul co-founded the National Gang Violence Prevention and Intervention Conference. In addition, Paul also worked as a consultant on community violence in a number of places around the world, including Guatemala, London, the Dominican Republic, Ireland, Tunisia, St. Kitts and Nevis, and El Salvador. Welcome, Paul. Rabbi Tirzah Firestone is an author, Jungian psychotherapist, and spiritual leader in the International Jewish Renewal Movement, and a renowned scholar and teacher. She is widely known for her groundbreaking work on Kabbalah, depth psychology, intergenerational trauma healing, and the reintegration of the feminine wisdom tradition within Judaism. Her latest book, Wounds into Wisdom, won the 2020 Nautilus Book Award Gold in Psychology and the Jewish Women's Caucus of the Association for Women in Psychology 2020 Book Award. So welcome both of you. Let me just spotlight both of you. Hold on. Okay. There we go. I want to start by, I did my formal introduction for the two of you, but I want the two of you to really introduce yourselves at this point, and I want to give the floor to each of you. Can you just briefly tell us a story, how you became peacemakers, what kinds of experience you may have had that propelled you to do the work that you both do? And I'm going to start with Paul.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you all for allowing me to have this opportunity to share this space with you and share some of my experiences and some of the work that I have done. And it's an honor to be a co-speaker with Tirzah, and tremendously privileged to be here with her and recognizing all of the wonderful work that she has done and continues to do. For me, and I like to tell stories, so I won't take up too much time. I have to kind of monitor myself. But I grew up, as my bio said, in a pretty dysfunctional family in South Los Angeles, lots of different types of violence and drugs, etc. There were a few people in my life, a couple people in my life that I was very close to that were murdered, and just really compelled me to do something, which I think is the case for many of us, if not all of us here on this Zoom, right? You see a need, and we do the work that presents itself to be done, right? And we respond and we take action. And so I'll share briefly two of those people. One was, I was involved in gangs. I was never very violent. I was in a bunch of fights or whatever, but I never took a person's life. That was not it was not in my DNA to do so. But there's a young kid who joined the gang because he was, kind of pushed out by his family. His father left when he was young. He had a stepfather who was abusive. And so he really looked to us for kinship, for acceptance. And as much as I tried to prevent him from joining the gang and hanging out with us, I could not. And so I kind of took him under my wing, so to speak, and would kind of teach him how to survive on the streets and how to try to stay out of trouble if possible. And he was 14, and and he was murdered at 14. So it wasn't so much maybe a year that he joined the gang and was hanging out with us, and he was murdered at 14. And I really felt like it was my fault, or I was responsible. And I remember the night of his murder, one of the police officers that knew us really well pulled up to this house where we're all congregating and mourning, and with his window down, and he tells me, all he said was, "Paul, you know this is your fault." That's all he said. And he said that because he knew that I was older than this 14-year-old boy. I was 20 years old. And I had a level of influence in the community and within the gang that I could have done more to prevent it. And I didn't. And so that was the start for me, was just kind of questioning myself. And what did I do, right? I obviously didn't, walk this kid into a house where somebody assassinated him, but nevertheless, I knew what he was getting himself into, what could happen when you're a part of a gang, and that I had that level of influence, or some level of influence, and it really bothered me. So that was the start of it. And then once around that same time that he was murdered, my first child was on the way, and I had always promised myself that I would not raise my children the way that my parents raised me. And I remember my mother visiting me once in juvenile hall, and she asked me, "What is your problem? Why do you keep getting in trouble?" And I looked her dead in the eye and said, "This is what you taught me." And it was absolutely true and justified, but in the moment. But in the same token, there comes a point in all of our lives where you can no longer blame mommy and daddy or whatever you experience. The decisions that we make in our lives impact us and us only. So I had to get over that. But my child on the way, and then this young man being murdered, is really what kind of got me to thinking that I need to do something to help others. And then really quickly, as I was doing the working in a hospital setting with victims of violent crime when they came in shot or stabbed, and trying to intervene at the bedside to offer various types of rehabilitative services, my uncle, who's also my godfather, was in a drive-by, was shot and murdered on my grandma's porch on Father's Day, and came to the hospital where I work. And so that was just like another level of, obviously, affirmations of why I need to do the work that I do, but also at the same time very traumatizing. But so those are a couple of the stories of kind of how I got into the work, and then why I still do the work.
Ooh, I hope everyone is taking some deep breaths because that is an earful. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm so honored to be here today, and I think that this is going to be just an honest conversation between Paul and me. Paul, I have a strong connection to your foundation where you work, where you're the vice president of the Gabby Giffords organization, because I have a child who took her own life, and through gun violence, and that's how I sought out Gabby. And that was when my husband and I appealed to the Gabby Giffords Foundation, because we realized that there must be change, and these are the people who are doing the work. So I'm incredibly honored to be sitting shoulder to shoulder with you, so to speak, today, Paul. I too, in a very, very different milieu, was raised in a sense, I was brought into a marinade. We all have the marinade, the culture that we are brought into by our parents and our homes and our families, and one of collective trauma, coming into a Jewish family just a couple of decades after the Holocaust. And in the aftermath of that trauma, that collective trauma that we're talking about today, about integrating and turning the injuries, turning the wounds into wisdom, doing the alchemy, the powerful alchemy of taking what we are given and transforming it, transmuting it into something useful for the world. I would say that my milieu in my family was full of a subtler violence than what Paul is describing, but still a violence because my mother was a German refugee who got out barely from Nazi Germany and as a teenager, and my father went right into Germany as a US soldier in the US Army and found himself in Bergen-Belsen upon liberation and saw more than, vicarious trauma is also a very powerful thing, and saw so much that he couldn't integrate it and stashed it away, literally hid his photographs away in a metal filing cabinet, which we found afterwards. And connecting the dots later on, my quest to flee my family and to discover the world and to discover other spiritual disciplines, to get out of a very, very rigid Jewish upbringing, brought me paradoxically right back into the heart of the pain. I think, like you, Paul, I gravitated right back into the field of trauma, but to study it, to understand it, to inquire about it. What makes people tick, and why is it that groups of people keep reproducing the same angst, the same injuries again and again, generation to generation? So as I studied psychology and I started to connect the dots and was studying what a traumatized person, what a traumatized ethnicity looks like, behaves like, because of what we hold in our nervous systems, I finally got, the light bulbs went off. I was raised by trauma survivors. No wonder there was that kind of collective electricity, the tempers flaring, the rigidity, the 0 to 10 hypervigilance and reactivity that one finds when they're in and among trauma survivors. So now, decades later, and I, as a rabbi and as a psychotherapist and as a teacher of people all over the world, I see that this work of trauma integration and trauma healing is certainly not exclusive to any one ethnicity. It really belongs. It's extremely prevalent in the world. It's widespread. These residues that perhaps we'll talk about a little bit more specifically are in the streets. They are explosive. It's the volatility and the violence that we're living with in the West, in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, in the United States and far beyond, is, for me, I'm a student of this byproduct of the cultural damages, the stored residues in people and in individuals, and as well as in entire communities, of the discrimination and the social injustices, the poverty, the violence that has not been able to be metabolized. And so it continues, and it's like a snowballing effect. Anyway, that's probably a good place to leave my own introduction for now.
So, Tirzah, in your book, Wounds into Wisdom, you do reference something called post-traumatic growth. This is some research that we've been delving into at Reimagine, how adversity, how those wounds might contribute to our self-knowledge, might allow us to transform. What I thought was really interesting in your book was that when you mentioned PTG, post-traumatic growth, you pointed out that what we know is taking action towards that growth can mean something different to different groups and people with different value systems. So, for example, with your research in Israel and Palestine, growth among certain constituents can mean that Jewish and Arab families whose loved ones were killed by terrorism, their action is to form dialogue groups. At the same time, there is also this move towards extremism. And I think there are many parallels to this world we're living in, particularly in the US, around gun violence and these mass shootings. To many of us, restricting the sales of military-grade weapons is taking an action towards transforming society. But to others, it's about arming teachers and arming our members of our family in our homes with more guns. In your experiences, and I'll probably kick this off to you, Paul, what is most effective in transforming people into peacemakers rather than towards extreme makers?
Well, in my work, there's a lot of emphasis on those at highest risk of being shot or doing the shooting. And when you look at over 45,000 gun deaths each year in this country is just an overwhelming number to even try to comprehend. And a large, I think the largest group within that 45,000 is obviously suicide, which is an ongoing issue, and we have to do a better job of addressing that as a country. In addition to that, when you talk about community violence, it's typically, gun violence. Communities of color are disproportionately more impacted than any other groups, primarily Black and Brown. So you're usually talking about inner city folks and communities, like I said, Black and Brown, in any given, mostly urban, but some rural, but mostly urban communities. And it usually looks like gun violence, or I'm sorry, gang violence. It's usually gang violence is the way that it's perpetrated, but there's also domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and then just kind of general crime, robberies, etc. But what we focus on in these inner cities is we try to identify folks who are in the community and want to foster change. And we call them homegrown peacemakers. And in any given city that you go to, they might have a different label: intervention workers, street outreach workers, etc. But these folks usually are folks who were previously incarcerated, former gang members. They're also mothers of murdered children, or spouses or siblings of someone who has been lost as a result of gun violence, who's been murdered. And these people want to do something. They want to make a difference, although their loved one is already has been lost, but they want to help others who are either going through the same situation, or help communities so that they don't have to experience that type of tragedy. And who else better than to help, right? Is somebody with that unfortunate experience. And so we invest a lot of time and energy and resources in identifying those folks. You can find them at any given community. A lot of times they can mobilize through like a faith-based initiative in any given denomination or belief in whatever community. But utilizing and working with and partnering with and empowering these homegrown peacemakers. And the kind of angle that they have is they can do interventions, and they can communicate with people that no one else can. So just imagine you have these two rivaling gangs in a community, and they've been at war for several years and shooting each other. And after several years, gangs even forget why they have an ongoing war. They just know that they do. But if you have a mother who perhaps is a mother of someone on one side of the conflict, and her son was murdered, she oftentimes can can approach them and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about what's going on. Or it could be somebody who's a former gang member, a former, producer of violence, gun violence, who did 10 years in prison and got out of prison and now wants to try to make a difference. That person can approach typically it's the younger generation who is out there still inflicting violence on each other and try to broker peace through mediation, conversations, and different types of conflict resolution tactics to try to bring peace. So homegrown peacemakers is what I like to call these individuals who want to save their community, even if, or especially because they were once part of the problem.
That's
Sorry. Go ahead.
it's incredibly inspiring, and I think that principle of taking our own pain, harnessing one of the principles that I learned from my research subjects in my book Wounds into Wisdom is to harness the power of our pain, to take our pain, to work it, to transform it, to grieve it, to wail it out, to do our own personal work, and then take action. So that's what I'm hearing you say, Paul, and that's so beautiful. But our work has to begin from where I sit, and I think that this is just another angle that I'm adding to what Paul has already said. Our work has to begin with ourselves, and if we're carrying trauma residue in our nervous system, we're not going to be as effective. We're going to be charged. We're going to be often hyper aroused. We're going to be much more prone to feeling PTSD when we come into the field of violence or injury. We're often dysregulated, or we can be numbed out. All of these are trauma residues, and when we don't do our own work, we take that energy into our activism. We take it into the advocacy that we're doing, and people can feel that we're not as trustworthy. We're volatile. People know that just by entering a room, may not even. It's really the unthought known, as one of the psychologists calls it. That our animal sense knows that this person is volatile, or this person, or we are we're charged, we're too charged. So I see this a lot with people who want to help and want to be advocates, want to be activists, but we're desperate to help. When we come from a place of I'm desperate to help, I've got to change the world, we know we need to come back and do the work on ourselves. We need to find our own self-care. We need to maybe do some more grieving. We may need to find better boundaries, whatever our personal work is, to feel ourselves and really come home to ourselves before we reach out to take action in the world. But then once we do, because the pain never goes away. It's not that the pain goes away of losing a child, or of losing a brother, or of being sexually assaulted. That is always with us when we can harness the power of that pain. And then we find our people, we find our community. We disidentify from being a victim. We start to become a survivor. We start to stand in our wisdom and what we know, and we move forward from that place. We are powerful individuals, and that's where post-traumatic growth begins to flourish. It's like a flower that starts to grow inside of us. We're transformed. We're different people. So I think the work on our, very basic, the work on our nervous systems is absolutely critical right now, because frankly, I'm a big advocate of watching the news, of knowing what's going on in the world, of following the unfolding crises and events, and how legislation of gun violence, the different stories that are breaking all over the country at all times. That is, quite frankly, can be very dysregulating, can be very triggering, and we need to be able to work through the dross of the news. We need to be able to discharge what's the best word? The aftermath of just reading the paper. And so we have to find that balance of being abreast of the news and also somehow letting it being Teflon coated, so to speak, but to let it discharge and be pulled out of our system, sloughed off. I guess that's something that I would offer here and I guess what we're not saying, but I'll say it in so many words. There is such a thing that is really a thing. It's a thing. Vicarious trauma, secondary trauma is really important for all of us who are interested in being advocates and staying on top of the news, on working with others, just being a rabbi, finding myself in the emergency room, sitting by somebody who's been lost and helping a grieving family. There is an aftermath to that. We have to be very careful that we are not accruing layers of vicarious trauma in our nervous systems. So all of this is important to maybe the shadow side of activism, the shadow side of being a peacemaker, that we have to really take care of ourselves.
I love that. If I could jump in, I personally, for the first 10 or so years of my career, we never even talked about self-care or vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. It was not even a mention. And my field is now, right before the pandemic and then with the pandemic, we have become more comfortable with having that on our radar. And I think, just Tirzah sharing that for me really validates you as an expert in your craft and in your field, because you're absolutely right, 100%. Because if we're not well, how effective are we going to be in helping others? And I think I'll speak for myself. I think I definitely jumped in the field to try to, subconsciously wrong some of the rights that I did, or saved a young man who I felt I was partially responsible for his murder, and never really stopped to think about my own healing and my own trauma that I experienced as a kid growing up, which is largely the reason why I got into this line of work. And so I would just encourage folks, and I do any chance that I get, for folks to at least be aware of that reality of compassion fatigue and burnout and vicarious trauma. And I see a therapist myself, just to help me continue to be well, mental wellness, and to process things that are currently going on in life, and perhaps even some unresolved stuff from when I was a child. But I used to run an organization of about 80 staff 2 years ago before I joined Giffords, and I remember I started to see some of the staff just kind of showing symptoms of something. And I was seeing an executive coach at the time, and he's written a few books. And I said, well, what are your books about? And he said, burnout, his expertise. He's done, some research in burnout. So as we start talking more about it and the symptoms of burnout, right? Like sense of failure, self-doubt, feeling helpless, detachment from the world, loss of motivation, just being negative, decreased satisfaction. I said, oh my gosh, I think I'm burned out. And then so I brought him in, and he did presentations with my staff, and some of them felt the same, and then we helped to get them treatment. But some of the things that he shared with me was that, in his findings, is that most people don't realize they're burned out until they're like right in the thick of it. And then once you're aware of it and you have a plan to work yourself out of it, it's on average 2 years. So imagine if someone doesn't know it or hasn't, let alone accepted it, that 2 years that clock is never starting, right? Until that happens. And then going back quickly to some points that Tirzah made, I totally subscribe to that. And I had to learn that during the pandemic, is sometimes just turning the news off for a few hours, a couple of days. And people would ask me, oh, you haven't heard about this? And I'm like, I'm trying to manage my bandwidth as it pertains to media that I consume, right? And so I definitely think finding little tricks here and there. And one last thing I'll say is I also encourage folks, and this is something that is usually like unheard of, is sometimes if you get a call and you're asked to respond to a tragedy, sometimes you have to find a way to say no. If you're not in a place where you can personally go and feel like you're going to be helpful, obviously you're not going to leave the person hanging and you want to find someone else or somebody to respond, right? But sometimes it may not be a good idea for you to go and respond to a tragedy for those reasons, for your own wellness.
And that is hard. That is really hard. I know as a rabbi, it's like to say no to anyone is almost impossible, because you feel the pain, you feel their vulnerability, and to respond with vulnerability. Sometimes that's the biggest teaching of all, is to say no. I'm not well enough, but I will find you a colleague to come right away. So using each other, calling upon one another and being willing to share our vulnerability, to say, I'm really still processing what happened to me last week, and I don't have the bandwidth to use Paul's word. I like that a lot. Can you fill in for me? And I'm happy to return the favor sometime. We need each other. And so calling upon each other is really nothing to be ashamed of. We're modeling, I think, as peacemakers and as healers, we're modeling, we're human, we're all human. And what's going on in the world right now, the intensity does seem like it's ratcheted up now, doesn't it? I think we all feel that. And the ceaseless breaking news alerts that pop up on our phones. And, I think it is, certainly unconscious, but it is all of it conspires to keep our nervous systems activated and like this, waiting for the shoe to drop. And that is that hyper arousal is actually one of the characteristic hallmarks of trauma residue, when we are always with bated breath, always waiting for something bad to happen. So maybe we could talk about tricks of the trade. Paul just mentioned one, just taking a news break, a media break, and how important that is sometimes. I would say we all know in our the healthy animals that we are, the animal side of us, we all know that being in nature and is really healing, even a few minutes. And it may be that you live in downtown, Manhattan, midtown Manhattan, and, get to a tree, get to an animal, pet your pet, hug a child, that's nature too. And Paul, just chime in if you have a favorite healthcare, self-care go-to practice, best practice. Maybe in a little bit we'll actually do a practice that we can all try together.
Oh, that'll be awesome. I will admit, over the last 2 years, I've tried a lot. Some things I feel like I took for granted in the past, and now I'm more intentional. But during the pandemic, obviously, none of us were going very many places, right? And I was working from home, and there's a small tree. My desk, I'm currently sitting in my living room. There's a small tree right in front of my house. And so what I did was I used to think, no offense to anyone, but I used to think bird watching was just like, how is that fun? Like birds, being birds. But I have like 6 or 7 bird feeders now on this small tree. And it's not, someone told me that doesn't classify me as a bird watcher, but maybe I'm in the beginning stages of becoming an official bird watcher. But I watched the birds with my son, my 10-year-old, and then we bought a book to try to figure out which type of birds they are, where they come from, the seasons that they're around, what they eat, etc. So that became a thing for me, a novice bird watcher, so to speak. Sunday, I went to the beach, and I got this idea from a friend I actually saw him at a funeral a few months back, and he said, I just came from the beach. And I said, well, what were you doing at the beach? He said, I have to go there periodically by myself with the chair and just sit there and just watch the waves and just take a break. And I thought that was interesting. So I tried that on Sunday. I went to Manhattan Beach here in LA with the chair by myself, and I just sat there alone with the beach for about an hour or two. My son is 10, so I will let my inner child come out and we'll play video games. He and I will play video games, like something that like as an adult, you feel like, well, I don't know if I have time to do that. And so we'll just hang out and just play video games. I love sports. I definitely subscribe to animals. My son got a new dog, and he does not leave me alone. But I will say this, because I know in the opening, Andy mentioned Uvalde. I was in Uvalde 3 days after the shooting last year, and then after that, we decided to do a project, and we went back a report, and went back several times to Uvalde and interviewed a bunch of people, parents who lost children, parents whose children were shot and survived, school faculty, community stakeholders, just a bunch of people. And we published our Uvalde report yesterday, and you can find it on our website, or I can paste it in the chat later if you're interested. But one of the things that I saw in response to that tragedy was like people came from all over the world that first weekend and were just in Uvalde. And it's a 90-minute drive outside of San Antonio. So it's not like the easiest place to just get off a plane and you're there. But one of the things that I saw several places, and I don't know if this is the correct term, are therapy dogs. They're mostly collies, if I remember correctly, and they had some in Walmart. They were just there with their handlers. And then they were at this community center, this plaza where a lot of people in Uvalde gathered, and it's a town of only 16,000 people. And I remember I was speaking to one of the handlers, and I said, do you do this for a living? And she said, yeah, we do. They have to raise funds or whatever, but they essentially are always going from one tragedy to the next. She said that prior to Uvalde, her previous deployment was I think it was in Florida, was it Miami, where that apartment complex collapsed on a bunch of people. Very, very tragic event. But I said, do people respond to these dogs? And she said, it's kind of hit or miss, but in her experience, she says she's found that children are the most responsive. She said that one time a mother and a child came up to her and her dog, and the child was petting her dog, and then the child started talking to the dog, and then her mother started weeping. And then her mother apologized and said, I'm sorry, my son hasn't spoken a word in 6 weeks since the tragedy, and or whatever the event was. And so the dog, the animal, to Tirzah's point, was very therapeutic and consoling to this child, and helped him to talk again, as an example. So those are some of the things that I've tried. And so I think we should be open to trying things that are obviously reasonable, ethical, legal, and sometimes just simplify it. Simple things that maybe we take for granted, like watching birds or playing video games or sitting on the beach by yourself.
Beautiful. Oh, God. Well, I feel myself so often in this, in our conversation, on the verge of tears. And I know that's, my heart is opening. Why don't we take a moment, everybody who's listening, and go inside, and I'll just share with you a very simple technique, which has been proven by all kinds of brain science research, to reset the nervous system when we're feeling drained, when we're feeling hyper aroused, when we're feeling disconnected, to go inside. It helps. I like to touch myself here, but you certainly don't have to, but just right on the sternum. You could begin by just, let's get quiet, and slowing things down really helps. Because often when we're talking about such things, where our breath is racing and our brain is going fast. And so we want to slow down, literally slow down our nervous system, our emotional brain. And we can begin by just breathing in, imagining you're breathing into your heart, or into your sternum, your chest, a breath that goes 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like smoothing out the breath. And out, 4, 3, 2, 1. You, of course, go at your own rhythm, but the idea is to smooth and lengthen the breath cycle. Sometimes in bed at night when my heart is racing, I'm thinking about all the things I have to do, I will just calm myself with this. Just this much is very, very good for the nervous system. Breathing 1, 2, 3, 4. And out to the same rhythm. And as your system starts to slow down, continue to do that. Maybe close your eyes or soften your eyes. I want you to imagine someone, it could be an ancestor, a grandparent, or teacher. It could also be a pet that you have had in your past. It could be it could be a place that you love in nature or a tree. One thing that you appreciate unmistakably. It's not, well, I like this, but I don't like this. It's something that you just love and appreciate and give thanks for. And as you breathe, it's as if you're breathing in that appreciation, breathing in the beauty, the feeling of that pet, the feeling of that love. To a count of 4, right into your heart. And relaxing to a count of 4 as you breathe out. Let's try that one more time, breathing in the appreciation, the thanks, the yes, that good feeling of someone, something you love, just even if it's imagining you're a dear, dear pet. Or a child, or a place, breathing in that goodness. And now the last step is to just spread that good feeling throughout your body, spreading that appreciation on your out breath, breathing it in, and then imagining that it's just filling out to your fingertips, to your belly, to your kneecaps, to your toes. Now you could literally do this at a red light, keeping your eyes open, not closed, just imagining with the smoothed out breath, something that you give thanks for, something that you appreciate, and just filling it out. It can be that research shows that even 1 minute of appreciative breathing like that can shift and reboot the nervous system. So just a simple something. When we give thanks, when we appreciate, and that's why so many traditions, religious traditions, I'll just add, begin the day with thanks, with thanksgiving, because it sets the nervous system. When we're in appreciation for something good, even though everything might be going wrong, it's you're walking into a hellacious situation, but you focus on your grandmother's hands, or you're hugging your dog, or the color of a daffodil, and breathing that in, it will change your brain and heart synchrony. So that's my little offering.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and special gratitude to our very unique guests today, the peacekeepers, the peacemakers, the hope keepers, Paul Carrillo of Giffords, and Rabbi Tirzah Firestone. Thank you both. And we hope to see you all soon. There is the AAPI Grief Circle coming up. That is next Tuesday. I hope you'll join us. And we'll be sending out a recording of this and the previous sessions for this series on collective trauma and transformation. Wishing you all a wonderful day, and we hope to see you soon. Bye, everybody.